The inner planes, more commonly called the elemental planes, are the planes of the D&D multiverse that are composed of the basic elements that everything else is made out of. They are called the inner planes partly because in the Great Wheel cosmology they are the inner part of the Great Ring, but also because they are the figurative core of the cosmos, as they are the building blocks of the multiverse. Each elemental plane consists mostly of one type of matter. So the plane of Earth is mostly solid stone, and the plane of air is an endless expanse of air. While the outer planes are where most gods dwell and are where you will find celestials, demons, devils, and beings that embody a specific alignment, the inner planes are where you find primordials and elementals, primal beings that embody matter itself. The outer planes are all about belief. Entire towns and planes of existence will change if enough people believe them to be different. If the gate town of Automata becomes too lawful, then it will move out of the Outlands and become part of Mechanus, because people believed it to be no different than Mechanus. However, the inner planes are about existence. They are the immutable reality that makes up the matter of the rest of the multiverse. As interplanar natives tend to say, believe what you want, fire still burns and wind still blows. The inner planes are the raw essence of nature. When I say nature, I don't mean life like plants and animals, I mean the matter and energy everything in the universe is made of. Because of this, it is raw and uncaring, making it extremely hostile to life from other planes, especially the material plane. So traveling here is not recommended without proper magical protections and preparations. Thankfully, if you watch my videos, you should have a good understanding of what you need to survive the elemental planes. Now, what exactly are all the different elemental planes, and where do they stand within D&D's cosmology? The inner planes are located within the Great Ring of the Great Wheel cosmology, which is the cosmology that 1st, 2nd, and 5th edition uses, and parts of 3rd edition, but it's a little weird there, I'll get into that later. While one must travel through the astral plane to get to the outer planes, traveling to the inner planes requires travel through the ethereal plane, as that is the transitive plane that connects the inner planes and the prime material plane. In total, there are 18 inner planes. There are the 4 major elemental planes that you are probably already familiar with: the elemental plane of fire, the plane of earth, plane of air, and the plane of water. You then have the 2 energy planes, the negative energy plane and the positive energy plane. These embody death and life, destruction and creation. Positive energy is what souls are made out of and what clerics call upon to heal wounds, while negative energy is what animates undead and is how they are able to drain levels in life. Then there are 12 minor planes, which are divided into the para-elemental planes and the quasi-elemental planes. The para-elemental planes are the spaces between 2 of the 4 major elemental planes. They consist of the para-elemental plane of smoke, which is between the elemental planes of air and fire, the plane of ice between air and water, the plane of ooze between earth and water, and the plane of magma between earth and fire. The quasi-elemental planes exist between one of the elemental planes and one of the energy planes. So, the quasi-elemental plane of lightning is located between the elemental plane of air and the positive energy plane, whereas on the other side of the plane of air, between it and the negative energy plane, is the quasi-elemental plane of vacuum. For fire, you have the plane of radiance on the positive side and the plane of ash on the negative side. Earth has the plane of minerals for positive and plane of dust for negative, and water has the plane of steam for positive and the plane of salt for negative. Everything I have said up to this point is true in the Great Wheel cosmology, specifically the 1st and 2nd edition version of the Great Wheel cosmology. Things are a little different in the other editions. While 3rd edition used the Great Wheel, it worked a little differently. In 3rd edition, the ethereal plane and the astral plane both connected to each other and all of the planes, so you could travel to the elemental planes via the ethereal, just like in 1st, 2nd, and 5th edition, but you could also get there via the astral. Additionally, 3rd edition only has the 2 energy planes and the 4 major elemental planes. It doesn't make any mention of the para or quasi-elemental planes, at least in the 3rd edition manual of the planes. They do get referenced in some Dragon magazine articles, I believe around that time, but they're not really referred to as specific planes. They're kind of kept vague and more like regions of other planes. 3rd edition, in addition to the Great Wheel, also used something called the World Tree Cosmology, but that was specific to the Forgotten Realms, and in that, the elemental planes were in the roots of the World Tree. In 4th edition, they used the World Axis Cosmology. In this cosmological map, there aren't individual planes for each element. Instead, all the elements and energies that make up the multiverse collide and mix with each other in a turbulent single plane called the Elemental Chaos. One might assume the reason it's like this in 4th edition is because of the Spell Plague, the event when Mystra, the goddess of magic, was killed and magic went wonky and stopped working right. This was the realm-shaking event that denoted the transition from 3rd to 4th edition. During this disruptive time, the planes themselves were affected and many were destroyed or combined with each other, so it's not unreasonable to claim the elemental planes combined together into the elemental chaos during this event. However, 4th edition also talks quite a bit on prehistory, the time before life existed on the material plane and the gods and primordials fought over its dominion. In these accounts, the elemental chaos is mentioned as existing, so it seems to have always been there. However, we know in the past, in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd edition, the elemental planes did exist as individual planes of each element, and the elemental chaos is never mentioned. So, either the elemental chaos did exist at one point, then separated into individual planes, and then were merged back together during the Spell Plague. This is simply a 4th edition retcon, or perhaps the individual planes and the elemental chaos have always existed simultaneously, and the different cosmologies used throughout the editions are just different ways of looking at the multiverse. They're all right, they just emphasize different parts. The Great Wheel focuses on the parts of the inner planes where one element dominates a region, whereas the World Axis focuses on the blurry border areas where different elements mix together. I believe this last possibility is the assumption that 5th edition goes with, which I'll discuss right now. In 5th edition, the elemental planes are once again separated, but the elemental chaos remains. The individual planes of fire, earth, ooze, smoke, etc. all exist, and in the heart of those planes is where its element is most pure. The core of the plane of fire would be almost nothing but flames that would incinerate the average mortal. Here is where most of the true elementals, archomentals, and the creatures that value the pure form of their element live. As one moves further outward, though, they'll eventually reach the plane's outer edges, where the plane begins to bleed into all the other inner planes. This is where the elemental chaos exists as it is in 5th edition. Now, if you move the opposite direction, you'll reach the innermost edges of the elemental planes. These are the parts of the inner planes that are closest to the prime material plane, feeding into the prime and creating the diverse landscapes that exist there. In these innermost edges, all 4 major elements form together to create land, skies, and seas. The plane's element still dominates, but it is a good mixture of all 4 and is hospitable, resembling the prime material plane more than the elemental planes. The borderlands of the plane of fire, for example, would have walkable land and breathable air. And while it would be uncomfortably hot, it wouldn't be any hotter than a desert on the prime, meaning a mortal could travel here and survive. Most inhabitants, such as genies, Zorn, Aarakocra, Mephits, and basically all natives that aren't true elementals, tend to live in these inner regions, so when someone talks about the elemental planes, they're normally referring to these inner parts and not the true plane. 5th edition maintains the 2 energy planes, the 4 major elemental planes, and the 4 para-elemental planes, but it makes no mention of the 8 quasi-elemental planes. Those seem to only exist in 1st and 2nd edition. Okay, now with all of that confusing nonsense out of the way, you might be wondering what cool locations exist in the plane of fire, or what exactly is the negative energy plane. I will go in depth in later videos where I will cover each inner plane individually, so next week I should have a video out on the plane of air, but for this video I am just going to be covering the properties common to all or at least most of the elemental planes. So let's talk about travel. How do you get to the inner planes? Well, the main transitive plane that connects to them is the ethereal plane. The same way the astral connects the material to the outer planes, the ethereal connects the material to the elemental planes. As I mentioned earlier, in 3rd edition, the astral also connected to the inner planes, and then in 4th edition, the ethereal plane didn't exist, and the astral was the only transitive plane you could use, and also connected to them. However, I am going to ignore the astral for this series, as I like to focus on Planescape material, and it's not applicable to the current edition of Dungeons & Dragons. The ethereal plane consists of 2 parts. The first is the deep ethereal, which is the heart of the plane. It is far removed from any of the bordering planes and is rarely visited. But the other part is called the border ethereal. This is the edge of the ethereal that borders the inner planes and the material plane. Each of these planes has its correlating border ethereal, which overlaps the plane. You can still see into and feel the inner planes from the border ethereal, but you get the minimum amount of hostile effects. Someone on the plane of fire's border ethereal might suffer a slight amount of heat damage, but nothing compared to the incineration you'd experience if you were actually on the plane of fire. Additionally, most elementals can't see into the ethereal plane, so you'd avoid the environmental hazards as well as the hostile creatures. This is not true in 1st edition, where every native to the inner planes can see into the border ethereal. Traveling this way involves finding your way into the deep ethereal, thinking about the plane you wish to travel to, then through this force of will you would find a color curtain whose color corresponded to the plane's border ethereal you wish to visit. One day I'll do a video on the ethereal plane and get more in depth on this process, but this video is not the place for that. Another common way of getting to the elemental planes are through elemental vortices. An elemental vortex is a place on the material plane where a single element concentrates and forms a portal to the respective elemental plane. Some examples include a vortex to the elemental plane of fire in the heart of a volcano, one to the plane of water at the bottom of a sea, the plane of earth in the center of a mountain chain, and the plane of air in the eye of a hurricane or a typhoon. These can only link to one of the major elemental planes, and not the quasi or para-elemental ones. Vortices to the energy planes are possible, but none have yet to be discovered, probably because the existence of one would be catastrophic to the surrounding area and no one would survive to document it. A vortex to the positive energy plane would be a massive surge of energy, such as from a star, while a vortex to the negative energy plane would suck in all the surrounding matter like a black hole. Some sages speculate that the Void card from a deck of many things transports the victim to the negative energy plane. Those are the two main and most common methods of traveling to the inner planes, but obviously there are other ways such as the Planeshift spell, the doors and sigil, and other magical gates. Now we've talked about how to get there. How do you travel within the planes? How do you find your destination? How do you get from one inner plane to another one? Well, it's almost impossible for a non-native to find a specific destination on the inner planes without help. The planes are infinitely long, so walking from one end to another without knowing the correct route is impossible. In 1st edition, a non-native moved at their normal movement rate, but at the end of each turn, the DM would make a random roll to determine the direction the character was moving, often causing them to end up right where they started. Either way, they never really went where they wanted to go. So the most common way of traveling on the elemental planes is via a guide. Elementals can move through their own element and go to any destination simply by willing it. This makes them useful as guides, assuming you pay them. Guides will only guide and will not participate in combat, escaping back into the elemental waste until it is safe to come out. The guide must have at least low intelligence and be given a suitable payment. Payments must be related to their element and worth 100 gold pieces per hour of service. Examples include gems for an earth guide, rare wood or other interesting fuels for a fire guide, perfume or other interesting smells for an air guide, and interesting scents and potions for a water guide. There are two exceptions to these payments. Elemental Grus take payments in the form of creatures slain and given to them, 1 hour of service per 10 hit points of slain creatures, and genies love the riches of the prime material plane, accepting 100 gold pieces worth of treasure per hour of service. If you pay a genie in magic items, in addition to serving as a guide, they will also fight and protect you for 1 hour for each 1,000 gold pieces worth of magic items. And if the magic item is a genie entrapping device, such as a ring of djinn summoning or a fruit bottle, they fight in all combats and take them as far as they possibly can with no additional demands, because they wish to destroy those items more than anything. In 1st and 2nd edition, if a traveler has an elemental guide native to the plane they're on, or native to an adjacent para or quasi-elemental plane, then it takes 10d10 hours to get to the border of another inner plane, and 10d100 hours to get to a specific location within the same plane. In lieu of a guide, you can also use magic to transform yourself into an elemental native to the plane you're on, and you would gain their natural sense of direction and be able to find your way around. However, you would travel at half the speed as a true native, since you're not actually native to the plane and are not used to it. In addition to guides, there's a couple other ways of getting around. The first is an elemental compass. An elemental compass is an item you can buy in Sigil and other planar markets near gates to the inner planes that points the user towards the various elemental frontiers. So, someone on the plane of air could use one to know what direction the paraplane of smoke and quasi-planes of lightning and vacuum are in, allowing you to find your way to the other inner planes. The other way of finding your way around are beacon seeds. Beacon seeds are minor magical charms that are keyed to a specific location on an inner plane. When swallowed, they will guide the swallower to that destination. Environment. So what kind of environmental aspects can you find on the inner planes? Well, the main one are elemental pockets. See, the elemental planes are obviously realms made out of a specific element, but they're not pure. Sometimes chunks of other elemental planes wander in, forming elemental pockets. You might encounter an orb of water floating in the plane of air, or a breathable space of air in the plane of earth. These are called pure pockets since they are purely their element without alterations. The other kind are called corrupted or mixed pockets, which are ones that have affected or been affected by the plane it's in, such as a great ball of fire in the plane of ice that's melting the surrounding ice into a pool of water below. Pockets can be anywhere between 10 yards and 10,000 miles across, and they generally have a 25% chance of housing a creature, usually an elemental native to its type, although some elements are more or less likely to contain life. Properties. Let's talk about the physical properties of the inner planes. When it comes to breathing, in first edition, only the plane of air had breathable air. Without finding a pocket of air, a typical mortal will suffocate on any other inner plane. In 2nd edition, a few of the planes do have breathable air, such as the quasi-plane of lightning, but they usually had limitations. Either way, most of the elemental planes were still not breathable. In 5th edition, as mentioned earlier, the inner edges of the elemental planes closest to the material would have breathable air, but the inner cores of the planes would only have their element. Time. So, in 1st edition, the way time worked on the inner planes was weird. The 1st edition manual of the planes makes a distinction between true time and subjective time. True time is how much time is actually passing and is consistent throughout the multiverse. One day on the material plane was one true day. However, true time did not alter the effects of time, such as hunger, sleep, and learning. This was affected by subjective time, which did vary from plane to plane. Subjective time on the inner planes passed twice as fast as true time, so one true day here is equal to 2 subjective days. What this means is a traveler from the prime material plane on the inner planes would get hungry twice as fast, and thus eat twice as often. They'd get tired twice as fast, and therefore sleep twice a day instead of once, but they would sleep for half the time, and they'd be able to prepare spells twice a day. Healing, spell research, and other long-term activities happen twice as fast. It also means that every day you spend here, 2 days pass in the material plane. I hope I explained that well. I read that section like 4 times and I still didn't quite understand it all the way. I couldn't find any mentions of time passing differently on the elemental planes in any edition other than 1st. So it seems that 1st edition just makes things a little more convoluted. Speaking of convoluted, let's talk about gravity. So in 1st edition, gravity in the inner planes is subjective. Each individual decides what direction their up and down are, and can change them at will. They could also not choose a down direction, and they would just float weightlessly. If a down direction is picked, they fall 1,000 feet per round. It takes 1 round to change direction, and you take normal fall damage when colliding with an object, 1d6 per 10 feet fell to a max of 20d6. So, if a cloud parts and reveals a giant rock in your path 900 feet away, since it takes a full round to change directions, and you fall 1,000 feet per round, you would hit that rock as if you fell 100 feet, taking 10d6 damage. Now this is where things get really weird. This is only for sentient creatures. Inanimate objects have no movement or gravity unless touching a sentient creature. Obviously, touching a country-sized rock wouldn't imbue it with your gravity. An object must have a mass equal to 10 times the mass of the sentient being or less to be affected. A crossbow bolt would stop in mid-air the second it leaves the crossbow, but if a sentient creature touched it, it would resume its momentum until no longer touching them. Thus, if you touched the crossbow bolt while standing in the direction it was moving, it would then impale you and deal normal damage. This only extends to 30 feet, so a lasso or rope would lose its movement and gravity once it got 30 feet out, but it would still keep the momentum. I don't understand why this is a thing, because if something doesn't have gravity, it would still have momentum and it would still move. You know, like if you shoot a crossbow in space, it would still move. If anything, it'd move forever. So why inanimate objects behave this way in first edition, where they stop in midair but not touching a sentient creature, is so bizarre. But you know, hey, it's a magic fantasy world. Magic weapons are immune to this and they function normally. Now, in 2nd and 3rd edition, some elemental planes did have gravity. However, the ones that didn't function similarly to 1st edition, where gravity was subjective and you could pick your own down direction. But the whole inanimate object stopping in midair thing is only in 1st edition, because like I said, 1st edition liked to be really confusing. Let's talk vision and senses. Now, these vary drastically between each plane. And since I will be covering each plane individually in later videos, where I will present this information, I don't really want to waste time repeating myself here, but I'll give a few examples. On the plane of air, since it is so open and clear, all vision types are doubled in range. Infravision does not function on the plane of fire, since everything is hot. The exception is for detecting creatures not native to the plane, in which case they appear as cool spots against the hot fire. And on the plane of Earth, unless you're in a pocket of another element, you're effectively blind since everything is solid stone. In 1st edition, Ultravision, which is the ability to see ultraviolet radiation, does not function on any of the inner planes for some reason. Now let's go to the magical properties. For the most part, spellcasting isn't affected by the magic of the plane, at least when compared to the outer planes and their magical shenanigans. Obviously, physical limitations still apply. You need air to vocalize the verbal spell components, and you need space for gesturing the somatic components. Obviously, every elemental plane will have its own unique magical properties that I will cover in later videos, but for now, I'll discuss the general properties that are true for all the planes. Just as a disclaimer, all this info on magical properties are from 1st and 2nd edition. 4th and 5th edition doesn't really have any, and 3rd edition does, but they're specific to each individual plane, so I will discuss those when I get to the planes in later videos. So first, let's talk about the absolute prohibitions. These are restrictions on magic that are always in effect, and there's not really any ways around them. Some elements just don't work well with each other. A wall of ice isn't going to last very long on the plane of fire, and there's really nothing you can do about that. Spells that create elemental matter will mix with the plane they're on. Casting Create Water on the elemental plane of Earth will create mud. Fire spells cast on the para-elemental plane of ice explode into steam rather than fire. Creatures native to the inner planes are not considered extraplanar when on the inner plane, since they're not from another plane, they're from there. So spells like Banishment won't work, but they will work on a mortal from the Prime. Any spell that summons a creature can only summon a creature native to the plane the caster is on, or a bordering plane. So someone on the plane of air could summon a creature from the plane of air, the para-elemental planes of smoke and ice, or the quasi-elemental planes of lightning and vacuum, but they couldn't summon a creature from any other plane. Obviously, creatures from the outer planes, such as demons, can't be summoned anywhere in the inner planes, since none of the elemental planes border the outer planes, but creatures from the ethereal could be summoned on any of them, since it borders all the inner planes. Spells that summon animals, monsters, or other prime material plane creatures instead summon elemental versions of them made from the element of the plane the caster is on. The exceptions are the energy planes, as they do not have an elemental type, and so these just don't function. Additionally, any creature summoned here is not bound to serve the spellcaster. They maintain their free will and must be convinced or magically dominated another way. Many wizards have lost their lives forgetting this important detail. In 1st edition, spells that affect material plane creatures such as Speak with Animals work on the elemental variant of the creature. So Speak with Animals would work on an animental, which is like an animal elemental, and the same works for charm spells. So Snake Charm will affect an elemental in serpentine form, where Hold Person will only work on an elemental in humanoid form, etc. Wizard restrictions. Now, all of these magical limitations that I just talked about affect all spellcasters. No matter who you are or what spell keys or power keys you have, you can't get around these restrictions, as the basic nature of the planes prevent it. Now, the next section of magical properties I will be discussing only affect arcane spellcasters such as wizards. Divine spellcasters, people who get their magic from the gods such as clerics, druids, rangers, and paladins, are not affected by these. Instead, they are considered one level lower for the sake of casting spells for each plane between this one and the plane their god dwells in. So if their god dwelled in the outer planes, as most gods do, since the astral, material, and ethereal are all between the inner planes and the outer planes, they would be considered 3 levels lower for the purposes of spellcasting. Their actual level isn't reduced. They keep their hit point stats, turn undead ability, and such. It's just the number and level of spells they can prepare and the power of those spells that is lowered. This is the case for 2nd edition. While 1st edition keeps many of the following restrictions, I believe they affected all spellcasters since I couldn't find any mention otherwise. Another thing to mention is these arcane restrictions can be bypassed by spell keys, which are specific ways of casting spells, such as using an extra material component or chanting different words, and knowledge of these can usually be traded or bought on the planes. Divine casters have their own version of these called power keys that can bypass their level reductions, but they must get these from a servitor of their god. Neither spell keys nor power keys can bypass any of the absolute prohibitions mentioned earlier. So what restrictions do arcane casters have to worry about on the inner planes? Well, since the inner planes don't touch the astral, spells that require the astral or outer planes do not function on the inner planes. This would include Contact Other Plane if contacting a being on the outer planes, Astral Spell, or Find Familiar. Here is a list of spells that required a connection to the astral in 2nd edition. Additionally, many schools of magic are altered depending on the plane the wizard is on. However, these are all specific to the individual planes, so I won't talk about these in this video, as I'll be talking about them in later videos. Magic items. In 1st edition, for each plane removed from the material plane, magical items with pluses, such as a +1 weapon or +1 armor, have their pluses reduced by 1. So, the material plane is 2 planes removed from the inner planes, since traveling here requires first going from the material to the ethereal, and then from the ethereal to the inner planes. So, magic items have their pluses reduced by 2 while on the inner planes. If this sets it below +1, then it is treated as non-magical. The exception are items that draw on the energy of the elemental planes, such as the flame tongue or energy-draining swords. In 2nd edition, the same rule applied, but it was dependent on where the item was forged. So, magic items forged on the prime material plane would lose 2 pluses just like in 1st edition, while one forged on the outer planes would lose 4, one forged on an adjacent inner plane would lose 1, and then one forged on the plane you were currently on would lose none. 1st edition just assumed that any magic items the player characters had were made on the prime material. Items that mimic spells would be subject to the spell alteration properties of each plane, even if it mimicked a pre-spell. Spell modifications. In 1st and 2nd edition, spells that rely on manipulating a specific element can be altered to affect other elements, although this requires time and money spent researching for each version. So, you could research how to turn your Wall of Fire spell into a Wall of Water, or turn a Create Water spell into a Create Air spell. This does not apply to the positive and negative energy planes since they're not actual elements. Spells that apply to entire planes, such as negative plane protection, can be modified to affect any other inner plane. In addition to researching these spells yourself, you can also find already modified ones in Sigil or Gate Towns for a moderate price. In 1st edition, these modified elemental spells only worked on the inner planes, and will not function on any other plane, although one can research a prime material equivalent, which takes half the amount of research time and is usually 1 level higher. In 2nd edition, these modified spells seem to work on any plane normally. Effects on player characters. In addition to the effects of spellcasting, in 1st edition, each class also had some of their abilities altered by the nature of the plane. Now, these are pretty convoluted, so I won't go over them in detail. They're up on the screen if you want to pause the video and read them, but the gist of it is that turning undead is harder, abilities focused on wilderness survival don't work, surprising or pickpocketing the natives is harder, and the paladin's immunity to disease ceases to function on the positive energy plane and the positive quasi-elemental planes. This is because the positive planes are all about maximizing growth in life, and a disease is a form of life. Inhabitants. All natives to an elemental plane are immune to that element. This is probably pretty obvious, but the implications aren't as obvious. So what I mean is, obviously a fire elemental would be immune to the fireball spell. However, an air elemental is immune to the stinking cloud and cloud kill spells since they are gas attacks. An earth elemental is immune to move earth or rock to mud, and creatures from the negative energy plane are immune to energy drain attacks such as from a vampire. If they are immune to their element, and all of them are made out of that element and deal damage based around it, this means that they must have ways of attacking that don't use their element. If a fire elemental could only burn things, then it would be completely useless at fighting anything while on their home plane of fire, which is where they're going to spend 99% if not 100% of their time. So they are all capable of altering their attacks to be physical, forceful strikes, dealing the same damage as a normal attack of theirs. Some are even capable of bypassing immunities, such as fire that is so hot it burns even fire elementals. Additionally, they aren't affected by any restrictions on their planes, so while travelers on the plane of Earth can't move, as they're trapped in by solid Earth all around them, an Earth elemental can freely glide through the stone. Elementals from the para or quasi-elemental planes are also immune to the restrictions and properties of their border planes, so an ooze elemental could move freely and suffer no ill effects in the plane of ooze, earth, and water. According to 1st edition, elementals can see into the border ethereal and travel there while within their native plane. However, 2nd edition states that only a few powerful types can do this. The elemental planes are not a lawful place, so to say that they have a hierarchy is a little generous and simplistic, but generally speaking, the smarter a creature is, the more powerful and therefore higher ranking it is. So let's discuss this so-called hierarchy, starting at the bottom. Fundamentals. Fundamentals are the weakest of elemental natives. They are narrow, two-dimensional creatures that resemble a pair of small wings without a body, made entirely out of one element. They don't really fit in the elemental hierarchy, as they aren't intelligent enough to work with any faction, or really have any motivation at all. Some believe they aren't even sentient, but simply animated pieces of matter. Others believe they are simply a fundamental expression of their element. Either way, they don't do much. They just are. Within their own element, they blend in, becoming 90% invisible when not moving, require magic weapons of +1 or greater to harm, and are immune to sleep and charm. Animentals. Animentals are elemental creatures that take on the shape of an animal from the prime material plane. See, when an animal on the prime dies, their spirit goes to whatever outer plane matches its alignment the closest, usually the Beastlands. However, sometimes there is a portion of its life energy that gets left over and sucked through a vortex into an elemental plane. The realm of primal energy and matter then creates a duplicate of the beast made entirely out of its element. This is how you get birds made from fire, snakes made from smoke, wolves made of water, and elks made from ice. These can also occasionally take the form of monsters, such as a basilisk of air or a beholder made from stone. I presume it follows the same process, but it's a monster's soul instead of an animal's that gets lost. 1st edition considered these separate from animentals, calling them elemental monsters, but 2nd edition seems to consider them a type of animental. 2nd edition says that no humanoid variants exist, but 1st edition did make mentions of elementals taking humanoid forms. Now, just because an animental takes the form of an elephant or beholder doesn't mean it looks exactly like one. They might be smaller or larger, have additional appendages, be shaped a little differently, etc. The elements are ever-shifting things that rarely stay in one exact form for long, with the exception of possibly earth elementals. Animentals are not truly living beings, but merely imitations of life. Remember, they're not actually made from a creature's soul, but a small sliver of that soul that was left over, so they don't have any culture. They almost never leave their home plane and are ignored by most inhabitants of the inner planes. However, they maintain the intelligence their counterpart had, so an intelligent creature like a beholder would still be capable of communicating and scheming. All animentals are meat-eaters, as there is no plant life on the elemental planes, and they prey upon visitors or other inhabitants found here. I find this sentence odd, as there aren't many, if any, creatures made of meat that dwell on the elemental planes, as most are just made simply out of the element themselves. Anyways, animentals have the same stats as their animal counterpart, but their elemental composition empowers their attacks, strengthens their armor class, and of course gives them attacks, immunities, and abilities based on their element. Special abilities they had in life, like regeneration, have a 50% chance of retaining, and spell-like abilities a 30% chance of retaining, otherwise they are lost. Abilities that revolve around an element the animental is not composed of usually are also lost, but 25% of the time they might be changed to fit their new form. So for example, a Medusa can normally turn people to stone. A Medusa made of fire wouldn't be able to do that, but she might turn victims to pillars of flame or volcanic rock. Elemental kin. Elemental kin are related to elementals, but they're not true elementals. Examples include salamanders, water weirds, aerial servants, and Azer. In most editions, these seem to be creatures in their own right, separate from elementals, existing on the inner planes alongside them. However, in 5th edition, some of these, such as invisible stalkers or water weirds, are actually just regular elementals that are shaped to fit a specific task when summoned to the prime material plane. This would imply that they don't exist in this form on their native plane, as they would be a bodiless consciousness just like other elementals, at least in 5th edition. Since these are all so different, I can't really say much about the elemental kin as a whole, but basically if a monster has the elemental type, but they're not an elemental, genie, animmental, or fundamental, then they're probably elemental kin. I'll talk more about them in my videos that cover each inner plane. One example of an elemental kin is the Gru. Grus are lesser elementals that normally serve more powerful beings. They tend to operate in groups, although the specific name for these clans and how their hierarchies function differ between the elemental types. Their true forms are vague humanoid shapes of their respective element, but they also sometimes take on animal forms. Unlike most elementals, Grus are evil aligned, specifically neutral evil. True elementals. There are many creatures that mortals call elementals, but truthfully, most of those are elemental kin. True elementals are the ones that you see in the monster manual just called elementals, and are the ones most often summoned by magic, such as the Conjure Elemental spell. They usually don't look like any specific creature or monster, they simply embody their element. So an air elemental might take on the form of a whirling vortex, while a fire elemental might look like a giant dancing flame. At least, this is what they look like when conjured to the prime material plane by magic. However, while on their native plane, they usually look different. According to 1st edition, they can take on a huge variety of forms in their home plane, from a thin stream of consciousness to massive blocks of their element. Whereas in 5th edition, they don't take physical forms at all while on their home plane, existing only as a bodiless life force. When they get summoned to the prime, they form a protective shell around them made out of their element, and once it is destroyed, they return to their home plane. According to 1st and 5th edition, true elementals are always simple-minded creatures with no culture, society, or even sense of being, wanting only to embody their element. But, according to 2nd edition, true elementals are intelligent creatures with entire societies and cultures. It is only when summoned to the prime material plane they get dumbed down, becoming mindless brutes for the duration. On their native planes, they usually organize into small bands led by the strongest and smartest members. They function similarly to family units in the sense that they are loyal and affectionate to each other. There is a 10% chance an elemental is good or evil, but most of the time they are neutral. Some can also be chaotic or lawful, but these end up being transformed into entirely new creatures, such as Aeolians, Aberdeen, Chris, and Hydrax. Elementals hate being enslaved and hate being away from their home plane, as it is painful, so summoning them is dangerous. Their fury is so powerful that controlling a summoned elemental takes immense concentration. Any distraction or movement during the casting will result in the caster losing control and the elemental being summoned free-willed. Additionally, concentration must be held during the duration, or the elemental will break free from its control, most likely attacking the caster, but sometimes they simply return to their plane. A Dispel Magic spell, instead of setting it free, can actually steal control of the elemental. However, if this fails, then the elemental is strengthened. Additionally, there's a 5% chance it becomes free-willed. On the prime material plane, they cannot be hurt by magical weapons weaker than a +2 unless the creature has more than 4 hit dice or possesses magical abilities, in 1st and 2nd edition. Elder Elementals. These are true elementals that have devoured lesser elementals, consuming their energy and transforming themselves into something far greater. They are gargantuan creatures of their element that harbor apocalyptic fates for any who are around when they are summoned. Like most elementals, they seek to simply be their element, which for creatures of this size and power usually means destroying and consuming everything near them. Examples of elder elementals include leviathans made of water, phoenixes made of fire, elder tempests, a creature of storm clouds, rain, wind, and lightning that resembles a winged serpent, and zeratans, a being of earth that resembles an armored turtle made from the landscape from which it was summoned. Next up, we have elemental monoliths. These are essentially the same as elder elementals in the sense that they are elementals that have gotten really powerful, except they're even more powerful than the elder elementals. They serve as princes and rulers of elemental kind, and the only elementals stronger than them are the archomentals. Speaking of which, let's talk about the archomentals. Archomentals are the most powerful of elemental creatures, rising above and subjugating the rest under their rule. While the elemental planes are primal forces of nature that are not concerned with the morality of the rest of the multiverse, the archomentals ignore this and take on the mantle of good and evil. Mortals refer to them as the princes of elemental evil and the princes of elemental good, but they despise the idea that they are merely one of a group instead of being a wholly unique being, so they don't use these titles. They do not rule their entire planes, but simply a region they have claimed as their own. According to 1st edition, they are the same power level as lesser deities, but in 2nd edition, they aren't quite gods, but equal to abyssal lords in power. However, they are capable of granting 3rd level spells to priests through faith alone, and 4th level spells if they meet in person. All the elementals have heard their names and respect their power. The known princes of elemental evil are Imix of the elemental plane of fire, Cryonax of the para-elemental plane of ice, Ogremok of the plane of earth, Olhydra of the water, Yensi Bin of air, and Bwim and his successor Bwim II of ooze. The known princes of elemental good are Chan of air, Ben-Hadar of water, Sunnis of earth, and Zaman-Rul of fire. There are other powerful beings that claim to rule the other inner planes, but whether they are true archomentals or not is up for debate. Gods. While the inner planes aren't really seen as godly realms, as this is reserved for the outer planes, there are a few gods living here. Unsurprisingly, they are mainly gods of the elements. When their worshippers die, they end up here as petitioners for their afterlife, just like the outer planar deities. Petitioners in the elemental planes become part of the plane around them. When their worshippers die, they end up here as petitioners for their afterlife, just like the outer planar deities. Petitioners in the elemental planes become part of the plane around them. So for example, a petitioner in the plane of fire would simply become flames within the environment. Some believe they become elementals, but this is unlikely, as elementals are too primal to just be dead mortals. The known elemental deities are Grumbar of earth, Kossuth of fire, Istitia of water, and Akkadi of air. Other. So there are a couple other inhabitants of the inner planes that I'm going to talk about, but I wasn't really sure where in the elemental hierarchy they fit, so I'm just throwing them in this other section. The first we're going to talk about are primordials. These are beings of, quote, manifest entropy and elemental might, end quote. These are extremely powerful elementals that, as far as I can tell, have always existed. It is believed that the elemental gods, the archomentals, and other powerful elementals are, or at least were, primordials. When realm space was first created, the primordials coveted it, but were defeated by the gods who sought to defend the land from their destruction. This war was called the Dawn War. Next up are the elemental myrmidons. These are the soldiers of the primordials, created at the beginning of time to fight the gods and their servants in the Dawn War. That being said, they don't hold any particular loyalty to the primordials, and will follow any strong leader that rallies them, working for a variety of powerful elemental creatures, especially the Ifrit. The Ifrit stole or learned the secrets of their creation, which involves binding the spirit of another elemental being to an especially crafted suit of armor, made in a forge built in a significant concentration of elemental energy. The Myrmidons themselves also know how to create more. In 4th edition, they were called Archons, but that name is confusing as shit because Archons are also a type of celestial found in Mount Celestia. Then there was another thing called Elemental Archons, which were a different thing that are mortals who worship one of the elemental gods. So 5th edition changed their name to Elemental Myrmidons so that it's not confusing. The last inhabitant we're going to talk about are genies. Now, I put genies in this other section because I wasn't quite sure where they fit in the elemental hierarchy. They seem to have their own societies and hierarchies outside of the ones of the elementals. They are also quite different from the rest of the elemental planes as natives, whereas basically every other inhabitant I've talked about are made out of their pure element. Earth Grus are made out of clay. Earth elementals are made out of solid rock. Grumbar, the god of earth, is a literal mountain, etc. Genies actually appear human-like. They have skin, hair, and eyes just like a person. Sometimes their legs turn into a whirl of their element when they fly, but most of the time they do have legs. Now, this doesn't mean that they are flesh and blood creatures. They are still beings of their element. When they die, no organs or gore are left behind. Only whatever they were wearing or carrying and a small trace of their element, such as a gust of wind or puff of smoke and flame. They say the Efreet are made of basalt, bronze, and congealed flames, but what the rest are made out of, I'm unsure. Another thing that makes genies unique are their origins. Most, if not all, of the other elemental beings are very primal in nature. They just simply exist because that's the natural state of things. We don't really know why or how elementals come into being, it just seems to be what the elemental planes do. However, genies are made from mortals. Specifically when a mortal's soul melds with the primordial matter of the elements. That is an extremely rare occurrence and is the only way a genie can be created, as they cannot reproduce with each other. This mortal's soul will decide the genie's gender and maybe one or two personality traits, but otherwise they don't retain any memories or connections at all to their mortal life. The elements simply use their soul as a building block for new life. Genies are decadent beings. They are obsessed with their image, wanting to flaunt their superiority over all beings, including other genies. In genie culture, status is determined by property. The more things you own, the bigger and more lavish your palace is, and the more creatures that are subservient to you, the cooler you look. Owning slaves is a very big part of this, and since property is important to their image, many genies treat their slaves like honored guests, taking great care of them. The four main genie kinds are the Jinn of the plane of air, Efreet of fire, Merid of water, and Tao of earth. They each have somewhat different cultures and hierarchies, so I'll talk more about them in later videos when I cover each elemental plane individually. Genies spoke the language of their plane, and they also had telepathy in every edition except for 5th. Some rare genies are extraordinarily powerful and capable of granting wishes. These are called noble genies. They can grant 1 to 3 wishes to a single creature, and then they can't grant wishes again for a year, and they can never grant wishes to that same mortal. They also can't grant wishes to other genies, only non-genies. According to 1st, 2nd, and 3rd edition, only Jinn, the genies of air, could have this ability to grant wishes, but 5th edition expanded this option to all 4 major genies. In addition to the 4 main types of genies, you also have the Jann. Jann are the weakest types of genies and usually serve the rest of genie kind. Unlike the others, they are not bonded to one particular element, but are made of all 4 and can survive in any of the 4 major elemental planes. For 48 hours, that is. After that, they take 1 damage for each extra hour spent until they return to the prime material plane. They then must spend 48 hours on the prime before returning to the elemental planes if they want to avoid further damage. See, unlike the other elemental creatures, Jann are actually native to the prime material plane, and they resemble very attractive, physically fit humans or half-elves. They usually have skin tones of golden sand or earth, allowing them to blend in with human populations. Their skin is more resilient than humans, they have higher strength, and a number of spell-like abilities they can use, such as invisibility 3 times a day, create food and water once a day, and become ethereal once a day. They can also plane shift to the elemental planes of fire, water, earth, and air, the astral plane, and the ethereal plane, bringing up to 6 others with them, extending their own protections from the elements to them. They can live up to 300 years, but just like mortals, they do need to eat, drink, and breathe. Now, why they are elemental beings and considered a type of genie, even though they're from the prime material plane and have many of the same restrictions as mortals do, I'm not really sure. There's not much information on their origins or how they reproduce. One story suggests they were created by powerful elementals as a substitute for genies, hoping they could circumvent the restrictions genies have on granting wishes to other genies. But this seems to have failed since Jann are not capable of granting wishes. Another legend states the first of their kind were created in the deserts of Zakara in the Forgotten Realms, giving all Jann magic resistance while in deserts. While on the material plane, Jann formed nomadic clans, living in colorful tents in isolated areas far from other civilizations. These clans were ruled by a sheik and 1 or 2 viziers, and were part of a greater tribe ruled by an emir. While on the elemental planes, they usually work for genies as servants, mercenaries, or slaves. According to the 2nd edition Monstrous manual, Jan are on good terms with Jinn, but shun the other 3 genie kinds. According to the 2nd edition book Lands of Fate, the Jan of Zakara liked Merid even more than Jinn, treating them as royalty. The last thing I want to touch on in this video is the language of the inner planes. In 2nd edition, genies had their own language called Janti, with each type having their own dialect. So Dao had the Dao dialect, Ifrit had the Ifrit dialect, etc. Invisible Stalkers also had their own language called Shai, so it's very likely that other elementals had their own languages as well, but I couldn't find any other specific examples. In 3rd edition, there were 4 major languages spoken on the inner planes. Ignan was spoken on the plane of fire, Aquan on water, Terran on earth, and Aran on air. These were considered 4 separate languages, meaning someone who only knew Aran couldn't understand someone speaking Terran. In 4th edition, all 4 of these were lumped together into one language called Primordial. And in 5th edition, Ignan, Aran, Terran, and Aquan were brought back, but are considered dialects of the Primordial language, meaning they are mutually intelligible. And that is the inner planes. Like I said, I am going to come out with videos very soon that cover each individual inner plane. This one was just a general overview. So if you want more specifics, if you want more detail, if you want to learn everything there is to know about the plane of air or the plane of ooze or what have you, I will be having videos coming out. So make sure you subscribe and click the bell icon so that you'll know when those are released. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video.